What happens when you truly understand the Holy Spirit living within you is not something dramatic on the surface, yet it is the most radical transformation a human being can experience. It does not begin with noise or outward signs. It begins with a quiet inner awakening, a realization that what you have been seeking in prayers, rituals, and distant hopes has always been present at the very center of your being. The Holy Spirit is not something that visits you occasionally or responds only when you are desperate. It is the very life animating your breath, your awareness, and your existence in this moment. When this understanding dawns, the idea of God as distant dissolves. You no longer relate to the divine as something you must persuade, impress, or chase. Instead, you begin to recognize a living presence already established within you, complete, whole, and intelligent. This realization changes the nature of prayer itself. Prayer is no longer begging for intervention. It becomes a silent communion, a listening, a resting in the awareness that divine wisdom is already speaking from within. As this awareness deepens, you naturally become still inside, not because you are forcing silence, but because the mind gradually releases its constant effort to control outcomes. You discover that guidance does not come from anxious thinking or emotional pressure. It comes as a quiet knowing, a gentle inner assurance that does not argue or explain itself. The Holy Spirit within you does not shout. It leads with clarity, peace, and certainty, and when you learn to trust this inner guidance, confusion begins to lose its power over you. One of the most profound changes that follows this understanding is the collapse of fear. Fear thrives on the belief that you are alone, unsupported, and responsible for holding your life together by your own strength. But when you know that the Spirit of God lives within you as your very source, fear no longer has a foundation to stand on. Lack begins to appear as a false assumption. You start to see that supply, wisdom, strength, and peace are not things you acquire from the outside world, but expressions of the divine life already functioning within you. This understanding also transforms effort. Much of human struggle comes from trying to make things happen through personal willpower. But when you become aware of the Holy Spirit within, you realize that your role is not to force life into alignment, but to allow life to express itself through you. Action becomes inspired rather than strained. Decisions arise naturally instead of being manufactured through anxiety. You find yourself doing less but accomplishing more, because the source of action is no longer ego-driven effort but spiritual intelligence. Relationships change as well. You begin to see others not merely as personalities or problems but as expressions of the same divine presence. Judgment softens. Conflict loses its intensity. You no longer need to defend your identity because your sense of self is anchored in something eternal rather than fragile human opinion. Compassion becomes natural, not forced, because you recognize that the same spirit living in you is also seeking expression in every other life. Daily life itself becomes sacred. Ordinary moments are no longer empty or meaningless. Work, rest, conversations, and even challenges are seen as opportunities for the Holy Spirit to reveal wisdom and order. You stop dividing life into spiritual and non-spiritual compartments. Everything becomes a place where divine life can be recognized and expressed simply because you are present and aware. Perhaps the greatest shift is this: you stop trying to become spiritual and start living from what already is. The Holy Spirit within you does not need development or improvement. It needs recognition. As you rest in this recognition, life begins to unfold with a quiet authority, a sense of rightness that cannot be produced by human planning alone. To truly understand the Holy Spirit living within you is to awaken from the belief that you are a separate, struggling individual and realize that you are a living expression of divine life itself. From that moment on, your life is no longer driven by fear or effort, but by an inner knowing that gently, faithfully, and effortlessly leads you into peace. To understand the Holy Spirit as an indwelling presence rather than an external power is to undergo a fundamental shift in spiritual perception. Most people are taught, consciously or unconsciously, to look outward for divine help, imagining the Spirit as something separate that descends at certain moments or responds only after intense prayer or suffering. This outward orientation creates distance, delay, and uncertainty because it places the source of life and guidance somewhere beyond immediate reach. When the Holy Spirit is recognized as living within, spirituality moves from seeking to recognizing, from hoping to knowing, from effort to awareness. The indwelling Spirit is not a visitor that comes and goes depending on behavior, mood, or worthiness. It is the very life principle animating consciousness itself. Every moment of awareness, every breath, every sense of being alive is already evidence of this presence. When this is seen clearly, the idea that one must attract or earn the Holy Spirit begins to dissolve. Divine life is not added to human life, it is what human life is made of. The Spirit is not something infused into you later, it is the source from which you are already living. This understanding removes the tension from spiritual practice. Instead of trying to reach God through mental effort, emotional intensity, or repeated words, one begins to rest inwardly. Attention turns from the surface activity of thought to the quiet depth of being. In that inward turning, there is often a subtle but unmistakable sense of completeness, as though something long sought has been found without effort. This is not imagination or self-hypnosis. It is the natural response of consciousness recognizing its own source. When the Holy Spirit is known as indwelling, authority shifts from external voices to inner discernment. Guidance no longer depends on signs, coincidences, or approval from others. There is an inner knowing that arises spontaneously, often without reasoning, carrying with it a sense of peace and certainty. This knowing does not argue or persuade, it simply is. Over time, trust in this inner guidance grows and life becomes less reactive, less driven by fear of making mistakes, because decisions are no longer made from isolation but from communion with the Spirit within. Seeing the Spirit as within also dissolves the idea of separation between the sacred and the ordinary. If divine life lives at the center of your being, then no moment is outside its presence. Work, rest, challenges, and routine activities are no longer spiritually neutral or empty. They become settings in which the indwelling Spirit expresses intelligence, order, creativity, and care. Life is no longer something you manage alone while occasionally asking for divine assistance. It is a continuous unfolding of divine life through conscious awareness. This awareness naturally changes how struggle is perceived. Many struggles persist because the individual believes they must face life with limited personal resources. When the Spirit is external, help feels uncertain and conditional. When the Spirit is recognized within, strength is no longer borrowed, it is native. Peace is not achieved by fixing circumstances but by returning awareness to the inner presence that remains steady regardless of circumstances. From that place, problems are approached with clarity rather than panic, and solutions arise more naturally than forcefully. The indwelling Spirit also reshapes identity. You begin to understand yourself not as a fragile personality trying to survive in a hostile world, but as an expression of divine life temporarily appearing as an individual form. This does not remove individuality, it grounds it. Personality becomes an instrument rather than a burden. Fear of loss, failure, or inadequacy gradually loosens its grip, because identity is no longer anchored in outcomes but in presence. As this understanding deepens, spiritual life becomes simpler and more intimate. There is less striving to be spiritual and more willingness to be still. Less effort to control and more openness to listen. The Holy Spirit is no longer imagined as distant help arriving in moments of crisis, but as constant life quietly sustaining, guiding, and expressing itself from within awareness itself. The shift from seeking God to recognizing God within is one of the most subtle yet life-altering changes that can occur in spiritual awareness. Seeking is based on the assumption that something essential is missing, that divine presence exists somewhere else and must be reached through effort, discipline, or special conditions. This assumption quietly reinforces a sense of separation, even when the desire for God is sincere. Recognition, on the other hand, begins when this assumption is questioned and eventually released. It is the realization that what has been sought has never been absent, only overlooked. Seeking often keeps the mind active and restless. There is always another prayer to say, another teaching to understand, another practice to perfect. The inner state fluctuates between hope and disappointment, progress and failure. Recognition brings a different movement altogether. Instead of reaching outward or upward, attention gently turns inward and settles into the awareness of being. In that simple awareness, there is a quiet sense of presence that does not need to be created or maintained. It is already there before any thought arises about it. When God is recognized within, prayer changes its nature completely. Prayer is no longer a request directed toward a distant power, it becomes an acknowledgement of an indwelling reality. Words become less important than listening. Silence becomes meaningful rather than empty. In this silence there is often a feeling of being accompanied, supported, and understood without explanation. This inner communion does not depend on emotional intensity or perfect concentration. It arises naturally when the effort to reach God is replaced by the willingness to be present with God. This shift also changes the way spiritual authority is experienced. When God is sought externally, authority is often placed in people, institutions, or methods. While these may point toward truth, they can never replace direct inner awareness. Recognition restores authority to immediate experience. Guidance is no longer something hoped for in the future, it is something noticed in the present. Insight comes quietly, sometimes as a gentle nudge, sometimes as sudden clarity, but always with a sense of peace that does not require justification. The recognition of God within softens the sense of urgency that drives much spiritual seeking. There is no longer a feeling that time is running out or that enlightenment must be achieved. Instead, there is patience and trust in the unfolding of awareness. Growth becomes less about accumulating spiritual achievements and more about removing what obscures what is already true. Old beliefs, fears, and habits gradually loosen not through force but through understanding. This inward recognition also reshapes daily life. When God is believed to be elsewhere, daily activities can feel disconnected from spiritual life. But when God is known within, every moment becomes a place of encounter. Simple actions take on a quiet depth because they are no longer performed in isolation. Even challenges are approached differently. Rather than asking why God is distant or silent, one naturally returns to the inner presence for clarity and balance. This return often brings a calm perspective that allows challenges to be met with wisdom instead of resistance. Emotionally, the shift from seeking to recognizing brings a sense of rest. The constant striving to become better, purer, or more worthy begins to fade. Worthiness is no longer something to be proven. It is inherent in the fact of being. This does not lead to passivity or indifference but to a more authentic engagement with life. Actions arise from inner alignment rather than obligation or fear. Over time, recognition deepens into a stable awareness that does not depend on circumstances. There may still be moments of doubt or distraction, but the underlying sense of presence remains accessible. One learns that God is not found by escaping life or transcending humanity, but by fully inhabiting the present moment with awareness. In this recognition, the long search quietly comes to rest, not because the journey failed, but because its purpose has been fulfilled in the simple knowing of what has always been within. Inner stillness as the doorway to divine guidance is not something that can be forced or manufactured by human effort. It arises naturally when the constant need to control, analyze, and anticipate begins to loosen. Most confusion in life does not come from a lack of answers but from an excess of mental noise. Thoughts compete, emotions pull in different directions, and fear demands immediate solutions. In this inner turbulence, even the most sincere spiritual desire can become entangled in anxiety. Stillness is the condition in which this turbulence settles, allowing a deeper intelligence to become perceptible. Stillness does not mean the absence of thought or activity. It is an inner posture of listening rather than reacting. A person can be outwardly busy and inwardly still, just as one can be physically quiet and mentally restless. True stillness begins when attention shifts from the stream of thoughts to the awareness in which those thoughts appear. This shift is subtle but powerful. Instead of being carried away by every idea or emotion, there is a gentle stepping back, a resting in awareness itself. In that resting, a sense of calm often emerges without any effort to create it. When the mind becomes still in this way, guidance does not arrive as dramatic commands or detailed instructions. It comes as clarity. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to appear simpler. The right action becomes obvious without being reasoned out step by step. This clarity is not emotional excitement, it is quiet certainty. It does not push or pressure. It carries a feeling of rightness that aligns thought, feeling, and action into one movement. This is why stillness is the doorway to divine guidance, because guidance speaks in the language of peace, not urgency. Many people miss this guidance because they expect it to come through intense experiences or external signs. They may wait for dramatic confirmations while ignoring the gentle inner knowing that is already present. Stillness trains awareness to recognize this subtle guidance. In stillness, one becomes sensitive to the difference between anxious impulses and inspired direction. Anxious impulses are urgent, repetitive, and fearful. Inspired direction is calm, steady, and quietly confident. Learning this distinction changes how decisions are made. Inner stillness also creates space for trust to develop. When the mind is constantly active, it assumes full responsibility for outcomes. It believes that if it stops thinking, things will fall apart. Stillness reveals the opposite. As mental effort relaxes, life continues to move with intelligence and order. This experience gradually builds trust in the deeper source of guidance operating within. Trust is not adopted as a belief, it grows from repeated experiences of being guided without strain. This stillness does not remove challenges from life, but it changes how they are met. Instead of reacting immediately, there is a pause. In that pause, perspective shifts, emotional intensity softens, and solutions arise that would not be accessible in a reactive state. Even when external circumstances remain the same, the inner experience is different. There is less fear of making the wrong choice because decisions are no longer made in isolation. They are made from communion with inner guidance. Over time, stillness becomes less something you practice and more something you return to naturally. It becomes an inner home base. In moments of uncertainty, attention instinctively turns inward rather than outward. You begin to recognize that guidance is not something you go out and get. It is something you allow to surface by becoming quiet enough to notice it. This noticing is effortless when resistance drops. As this relationship with stillness deepens, life takes on a sense of flow. Actions feel timely rather than forced. Words come when needed and fall away when unnecessary. You are no longer driven by the fear of missing guidance because you understand that guidance is not fragile or rare. It is constant, but it requires inner stillness to be recognized. In that stillness, Divine intelligence is not distant or mysterious, it is intimately present, quietly shaping each step from within awareness itself. Freedom from fear, lack, and struggle through spiritual awareness does not come from changing external circumstances, but from a fundamental shift in how life is understood. Fear and lack are rooted in the belief that life is limited and that the individual is separate from the source of support, intelligence, and supply. When awareness is confined to appearances, conditions seem to determine security, peace, and success. Spiritual awareness gently dissolves this belief by revealing a deeper reality operating beneath changing circumstances. Fear thrives when the future is imagined as uncertain and unsupported. The mind projects possible losses and prepares for them through tension and control. Spiritual awareness interrupts this cycle by anchoring attention in the present moment, where divine life is already functioning. In the present there is breath, awareness, and existence itself, all sustained without personal effort. Recognizing this ongoing support weakens fear at its root. Fear does not disappear because problems vanish, but because the assumption of being alone with those problems no longer feels true. The sense of lack follows a similar pattern. Lack is not merely about material shortage. It is the inner feeling that something essential is missing. This feeling persists even when outer needs are met because it is based on separation from source. Spiritual awareness reveals that supply is not external to life but an expression of it. Intelligence, creativity, opportunity, and provision arise naturally when awareness is aligned with the source within. This does not mean that material conditions instantly change, but the inner sense of deficiency gives way to trust and expectancy. From this inner fullness, practical solutions emerge more naturally. Struggle is often glorified as necessary for growth, yet much struggle is created by resistance to what is already present. When the mind insists that life must unfold in a particular way, tension arises. Spiritual awareness softens this resistance. It does not produce passivity, but a willingness to cooperate with the deeper movement of life. Action taken from this awareness feels lighter and more effective, because it is aligned with inner intelligence rather than driven by fear of failure. As spiritual awareness deepens, the individual begins to see that fear, lack, and struggle are not personal flaws but conditioned responses. They are habits of thought learned over time. Seeing them as habits rather than identities creates distance. One no longer says, "I am afraid," but notices fear as a passing state within awareness. This shift is subtle yet liberating. What is observed no longer controls the observer. Awareness itself remains untouched by the fluctuations it witnesses. This awareness also brings compassion toward oneself. Many people fight fear and lack with self-judgment, believing they should be more faithful or confident. Spiritual awareness replaces judgment with understanding. Fear is met with presence rather than resistance. In that presence, fear often dissolves on its own, because it is no longer fed by attention and belief. The same applies to feelings of lack. When they are seen clearly without identification, their grip weakens. Freedom does not mean that challenges cease to arise. It means that challenges are no longer interpreted as threats to identity or survival. They become situations to be met with clarity and responsiveness. Spiritual awareness creates an inner stability that is not dependent on outcomes. Even when results are uncertain, there is a sense of being held by something larger than personal effort. This sense of being held is what dissolves the constant inner struggle to control everything. Over time, this awareness reshapes the nervous system itself. The body learns that it does not need to remain in a constant state of alert. Peace becomes more familiar than tension. This peace is not the absence of activity, but the absence of inner conflict. Life continues to move, decisions are made, responsibilities are met, but they are no longer carried with the weight of fear and lack. As this way of seeing becomes natural, freedom is no longer something sought as a future state. It is experienced as the present condition of awareness itself. Fear, lack, and struggle may still appear at times, but they are recognized as temporary movements rather than defining realities. In this recognition, life is lived with greater ease, trust, and quiet confidence, rooted in the awareness of an ever-present source sustaining every moment from within. Living by spiritual discernment rather than human effort marks a profound change in how life is approached and experienced. Human effort is driven largely by personal will, fear of outcomes, and the belief that success or failure depends entirely on individual strength. This mode of living is exhausting because it places the full weight of life on a limited sense of self. Spiritual discernment introduces a different orientation, one that listens before acting and allows guidance to shape movement rather than forcing direction through strain. Human effort tends to rely on analysis, comparison, and constant planning. While these tools have practical value, they become burdensome when they are used as the sole source of direction. The mind tries to anticipate every possibility, avoid every mistake, and secure every outcome. This creates inner pressure and often leads to actions that are reactive rather than wise. Spiritual discernment begins where this pressure is released. It is the capacity to sense what is aligned, timely, and appropriate without needing to mentally exhaust every option. Discernment does not arise from emotional impulse or personal desire alone. It emerges from a quiet inner sensitivity that develops through awareness and stillness. In this sensitivity, one begins to notice subtle cues that are easily overlooked in a hurried state of mind. There may be a sense of ease around a certain choice or a lack of peace around another. These signals are not logical arguments, yet they carry clarity. Acting from discernment often feels simple and direct, even when the action itself requires courage. Living this way reduces unnecessary struggle. When actions are guided by discernment, there is less need to push against resistance. Obstacles are not interpreted as signs of failure but as information. Sometimes discernment reveals that waiting is wiser than acting. In a culture that equates movement with progress, this can feel uncomfortable. Yet waiting guided by inner clarity often saves energy and prevents misalignment. Human effort tends to equate effort with value, while discernment values alignment over exertion. This way of living also reshapes the relationship with success and failure. When actions are taken from personal will alone, outcomes are closely tied to self-worth. Success inflates the ego, and failure feels devastating. Discernment shifts the focus from outcome to integrity of action. One learns to trust that acting in alignment is success in itself, regardless of external results. This trust brings emotional stability because self-worth is no longer dependent on how things appear. Spiritual discernment also fosters humility. It acknowledges that personal understanding is limited and that a deeper intelligence is available. This humility is not weakness, it is openness. It allows learning, correction, and redirection without shame. When a mistake occurs, it is met with curiosity rather than self-criticism. Human effort resists error because it threatens control. Discernment uses error as feedback, adjusting gently without collapsing into guilt. As discernment becomes more familiar, life begins to feel less like a constant problem to solve and more like a dialogue. Decisions arise in response to inner clarity rather than external pressure. Even in complex situations, there is often a simple next step that becomes clear when attention is inward. This simplicity does not eliminate responsibility, it clarifies it. One knows what to do now without carrying the weight of the entire future. Over time, reliance on discernment cultivates trust in life itself. The fear that life will fall apart without constant control gradually fades. Experience shows that when actions are aligned, support often appears in unexpected ways. Resources, timing, and cooperation seem to fall into place more naturally. This is not because effort has been abandoned, but because effort is now guided rather than forced. Living by spiritual discernment does not remove discipline or commitment. It refines them. Energy is directed where it is truly needed rather than scattered across anxious striving. The inner state becomes calmer, and the outer actions become more effective. Life is no longer a test of endurance but an unfolding guided by inner wisdom, where each step is taken with clarity rather than compulsion, and effort becomes an expression of alignment rather than a substitute for trust. The transformation of daily life through conscious union with spirit is not an abstract spiritual idea but a practical shift in how each moment is lived and perceived. Conscious union means awareness of an ongoing relationship with the divine presence within, not as a belief held in the background, but as a lived recognition shaping thought, perception and response. When this union becomes conscious, daily life no longer feels fragmented into spiritual moments and ordinary moments. All of life is experienced as one continuous movement of presence. In this union, ordinary activities take on a new quality. Tasks that once felt mechanical or burdensome are approached with greater attentiveness and ease. This is not because the tasks themselves change, but because the sense of isolation disappears. Actions are no longer performed from a sense of personal strain but from inner alignment. There is a quiet feeling of participation rather than struggle, as though life is moving through you rather than being pushed by you. Even simple actions carry a sense of meaning because they are no longer disconnected from awareness. Conscious union also reshapes time. Much stress comes from living mentally in the past or future, replaying what has happened or worrying about what might occur. Union draws attention back into the present, where spirit is experienced as active and sustaining. In the present moment there is less urgency and more clarity. Decisions are made with a grounded awareness rather than rushed anxiety. The present becomes sufficient not as a concept but as a lived experience. Emotionally, daily life becomes more balanced. Feelings still arise, but they are held within a wider field of awareness. Joy is appreciated without grasping, and difficulty is met without despair. This emotional stability does not come from emotional suppression, but from the understanding that emotions move through awareness rather than define it. Conscious union provides an inner anchor that remains steady even as experiences change. Relationships are deeply affected by this shift. When union with spirit is conscious, interactions are less reactive. There is more listening and less defensiveness. Others are no longer seen primarily as threats to peace or sources of validation, but as expressions of the same life. This perception naturally gives rise to patience and compassion. Conflicts may still arise, but they are addressed from a place of clarity rather than emotional charge. The need to control or prove oneself diminishes, creating space for genuine connection. This union also influences how challenges are encountered. Instead of asking why difficulties happen or trying to escape them, attention turns inward for guidance and strength. Challenges are not immediately labeled as obstacles but as situations calling for discernment. This shift reduces inner resistance. Even when solutions are not immediately visible, there is trust in the unfolding process. This trust is not blind optimism, it is grounded in repeated experience of being supported from within. Daily choices become more intentional. What once felt automatic is now approached with awareness. Speech becomes more considered, not out of fear but out of sensitivity. Consumption of information, relationships, and activities is guided by inner resonance rather than habit. This does not make life rigid or overly cautious, it makes it more authentic. Actions reflect inner truth rather than external pressure. Over time, this conscious union simplifies life. Many activities driven by insecurity or distraction naturally fall away. What remains feels essential and life-giving. Energy is conserved rather than scattered. There is a sense of living from the center rather than the edges. This simplicity brings clarity, allowing life to be lived more fully with less inner conflict. As this way of living stabilizes, gratitude becomes natural, not as a practiced attitude but as a response to the recognition of constant support and presence. Life is no longer experienced as a series of problems to solve but as a continuous relationship unfolding moment by moment. In this unfolding, daily life itself becomes the expression of union, where spirit is not sought apart from living but recognized in the very act of living itself. When all of this is seen together, the understanding of the Holy Spirit living within you brings life back to its natural simplicity. You realize that nothing essential is missing and nothing divine is distant. What once appeared as something to be reached is now known as something already present, quietly sustaining every moment of existence. This recognition ends the restless search and replaces it with an inner listening that guides without strain and supports without condition. From this awareness, fear, lack, and constant effort lose their authority. Life is no longer carried by personal strength alone but unfolds through cooperation with an intelligence greater than thought. Stillness becomes familiar, discernment becomes natural, and daily living becomes an expression of inner alignment rather than survival. You no longer divide life into spiritual and ordinary experiences, because the same presence animates them all. In this understanding, action flows without pressure, trust replaces anxiety, and challenges are met with clarity instead of resistance. What changes most is not the outer form of life, but the inner relationship to it. You live from union rather than separation, from awareness rather than striving, and from peace rather than fear. In this quiet knowing, the Holy Spirit is no longer an idea or belief, but the lived reality of life itself, expressing through you moment by moment as wisdom, guidance, and peace.